This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Black girls are significantly more likely to receive harsh discipline at school than their white female classmates, including being suspended multiple times and even referred to law enforcement. That's the conclusion from new analysis of federal education data by Erica Green and her colleagues at the New York Times. They looked at how racial and gender biases are devastating the emotional well-being and academic trajectories of Black girls across the country. She joins us now. Erica, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Why was this a story you wanted to tell now?
Well, it was a story that I set out to tell 2 years ago when the most recent civil rights data collection was published by the Department of Education. Immediately after it was released in April 2018, I looked for Black girls because it was a continuation of reporting that I had started at the Baltimore Sun when I reported on how girls were treated in the juvenile justice system in Maryland. And one of the common themes during that project was how they were treated in school. And we were so narrowly focused on confinement that we didn't get around to really giving enough space and time to the issue of the school part of the school to prison pipeline. I honestly had chipped away at it on top of my other responsibilities covering the Department of Education ever since April 2018. And really, we were waiting for young women to come around. And when Binghamton, New York, the incident there happened with the alleged strip searches of the 4 young women, I kind of knew that that was very illustrative of all that I had read and understood about the discipline disparities between Black girls and white girls. And I had actually tried to talk to those young women for about a year, and they just were not ready to talk. They were traumatized. You know, we had heard from their advocates and attorneys that they just did not want to be pegged to this incident. It had consumed their lives. And so, over the course of that time, there were so many other examples of young Black girls being subjected to harsh discipline. So we had enough, but I really felt strongly that 4 young girls giggling and being searched for that under the presumption that they were possibly on drugs was just about as illustrative as we could get. I got a call in August that they were ready to talk if I was still interested in doing this story. And given the reckoning that we're seeing across the country, not just with race, but with Black womanhood, I thought that it was necessary to elevate the issue of Black girlhood, because we all know that, women are girls first, and they carry so much of what happens to them in childhood into adulthood. So, it was a combination of working on it for so long, really having the right subjects, and the timing that was really driven by them. And it happened to be quite complimentary of where we are now as a nation and the debates taking place around Black people in general.
There's a lot to unpack here. And certainly when you talk about timing, it's hard not to think about this through the lens of, okay, are we finally at a point where we can focus on this and have to focus on this, just what's happening with current events? But you also think about how long it took for the conversation to shift to focus on Black boys. So now we have this, sort of the lens sort of expanding, and we want to make it clear that no one's saying we need to stop talking about Black boys, but certainly, this spotlight needs to shift.
Right. I was very sensitive to that. And the fact of the matter is I've been an education reporter for a long time now, and most of the discipline stories that I've written over the course of my career have focused on Black boys. Even, when Arnie Duncan and Eric Holder unveiled the 2014 discipline guidance from the Obama administration, they unveiled that in Baltimore when I was a reporter at the Sun. And, I think we all can say that there are groups of students that we just don't elevate as much as others. I'm complicit in that. I think education reporters are in general. That's driven some of my work in other areas, like when I did the story of Native American students. We get this data, we look at graphics, and we tend to stop once the graphs get lower and lower and lower. And there is a reality that if your numbers aren't high enough, you're kind of rendered invisible in conversations. And, I think I've said this before, and I say it a lot, that there are no invisible children. It doesn't mean that there should be any less attention on Black boys. But what's really striking is, advocates have been kind of screaming this from the rooftops for years and years. Like, I don't think we broke any big new ground here. And, the numbers have been there. Girls have been trailing Black boys for some time. This was raised when President Obama announced My Brother's Keeper. And folks were very much like, okay, where's my sister's keeper? Since, their rates are like, 2 percentage points behind. They're the only girls represented in the top five, suspended categories. It's just, it's one of those things that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? And I don't think anyone intentionally was not paying attention to Black girls. It just was time.
There is some new research that's come out around looking at the experiences of Black girls related to school discipline. What are some of the big takeaways?
Yeah, so I would say the first set of research that captured my attention was out of Georgetown, and that was the adultification studies. They came out in 2017 and then a second one in 2019. And that was really, beyond statistics, right? That was the first set of research that I personally saw that really dug deep into this perception of Black girls by adults. So it was really qualitative. And it showed kind of what I think any Black woman in America knew in their hearts since they were children. And it's that, Black girls were just seen as more mature, more resilient, more provocative. I mean, you'll be hard pressed to find very many Black women who won't tell you that, they were somehow chastised for how they dressed. They were in need of less nurturing, less protection. Black girls were seen as less innocent. And, when I saw this study, so much started to come back to me just from being a reporter. And it was things that, young people would say, like, well, we got in a fight and I got in trouble and she didn't. And that sounds very, that sounds like kid stuff, but it isn't, right? This was kind of the first time that I saw that it was actually maybe adult stuff that was being projected. And so that particular study was pretty groundbreaking because, someone had gone and done the work of figuring out why Black girls were feeling the way that they were and why we might be seeing these rates. Of course, National Women's Law Center, Education Trust have elevated the issue of the statistics alone. And NWLC in particular did their dress coded report that really drilled down on DC and how girls of color were being impacted by just basic uniform standards, right? And so there was this kind of flurry of research that was really starting to dig behind the numbers. And I will mention, like, there was an adultification study done on boys a few years before the girl study. And I will just say the researcher said, because she said on the record, that she does believe that the girl study got support because one had been done for boys first. So as folks have started to actually talk to girls, which is a recent development, I would say, it's really brought to light that the rates alone may not be high enough to capture the national attention, but the reasons and what's driving them certainly should. So yeah, and I'll just say also, I mean, I read Monique Morris's book, Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls, back in 2016 when I did the project for the Sun on girls in the juvenile justice system, and that was very illuminating. I felt like I was reading some of like my life story. I had to reflect and be like, wow, did that happen to me? And so all of that has been very, I think, validating to what a lot of us have probably heard over the course of our career.
Was there other things that you found or read that were illuminating or helpful for you? Because, I mean, certainly a lot of our listeners won't have this shared experience. And as you know, the majority of the journalism profession, especially the education journalism profession, are white and female. So where might they go to get a little smarter about all this?
Yeah, I mean, to the resources that I just mentioned, all of those were incredibly helpful. And, for me, let me just say, it's in terms of shared experience, like I have never been suspended. I probably should have been because, I grew up in a way that had me a little rough around the edges. But there wasn't a teacher who thought I should be kicked out of school. And so I guess I understand the reverse, right? Like, what my trajectory could have looked like had I been suspended multiple times, or even, let's not even talk about subjective stuff like my attitude and my outward presentation, but just even for fights. I think those two are very different categories. But I didn't have the experience of being suspended from school or expelled from school. And so a lot of this for me was understanding what it's like to just be in a school where you're under a microscope, and a different microscope than everybody else. And that's not just white girls, that's Black boys too. I mean, there were so many intricacies and nuances, and so much came out when I just talked to Black girls that I just never even thought about. I mean, I really didn't. So I would say I tend to do a lot of research. I consume everything. I read as much as I can about the topics that I write about, whether it's my colleagues' stories, research, studies. I absorb it all before I set out to write a story or interview folks, because the best stories don't come from, unless you're writing an opinion piece, your experience. It comes from others, right? So yeah, I would just say the people who have been doing the work, like the Georgetown studies, Monique Morris, Kimberly Crenshaw, and the NAACP. I mean, I had no idea that they had put out so many reports on this because, again, they just were not elevated. I mean, they were definitely written about here and there, but there's a lot out there. I was not at a loss. So yeah, I would say go about it the way you go about any particular story, but just remember that the best information, the most illuminating information is going to come from talking to young people themselves.
We're talking with Erica Green about the battle for the souls of Black girls, a New York Times investigation into racial and gender bias in school discipline. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback will help us grow. Erica, you had two co-authors on this project. We want to mention their work as well. Tell us about Mark Walker and then also Eliza Shapiro.
Sure. So Mark was the data master. He crunched the numbers for us. Again, this is public data. It's been cited before in stories and reports. But he really drilled down and not only looked at Black girl data in isolation, but how it compared to other groups of students, which was really helpful in allowing us to not just say, look at how disparate these rates are, or look how high these rates are, but look at these rates compared to Black male students and their white counterparts. Look at these rates compared to, Black girls, and not just white girls, but Hispanic girls and Native American girls. So it allowed us to go beyond Black girls are just, harshly disciplined. It allowed us to say, Black girls are arguably the most at-risk students in the country. And if someone came back to us to ask us why, we had a whole lot of data to show them why. When we say, I think what we did that I hadn't seen, and again, there's just been such great work on this topic. Like, Monica Roar's story from last year was really, really great. But, I think what was really surprising to people was that the disparities between Black and white girls were bigger in so many categories than Black and white boys. I think that's what really shocked people. I know it even shocked Mark. And they were pretty big, right? I mean, we have, everybody knows that Black girls are 5 times, it's actually nearly 6, but 5, because Mark was very clear about how you'd use data. 5 times more likely than white girls to be suspended at least once. And Black boys were just twice more likely to be suspended than white boys. Black girls were 7 times more likely to be suspended multiple times than white girls. Black boys were 2.6 times more likely. I mean, that's huge, right? Because when we think of disparity, we really do tend to go to Black boys because they are so endangered in this country, and they definitely lead in all categories. But it's usually in the context of disparity compared to. And for girls, it was stunning. It was stunning that their disparities were bigger. We didn't get into this in the story, but just, the amount of time lost out of school for Black girls because of suspension and discipline was huge. So again, it allowed us to really elevate data points that have driven this conversation for so long for this population to say, hey, if this is where we're heading, if this is what's driving policy reforms, you're ignoring like some pretty significant disparities here too. So yeah, so that was Mark. Eliza, I mean, we all know Eliza Shapiro is a machine. I mean, and when the girls' data was released in April of 2 years ago, I mean, she was really the first person I called. And I'm like, I think we should do this. And she's been with me every step of the way. I mean, there have been times that I was not working on this story and she was for weeks at a time. She interviewed dozens of girls in New York. She just never stopped. So, she brought in the New York data. She wrote with me. She edited me. She gut checked me. She was just, we wrote it together. We did it together. And, you saw the interviews in the story, but that was like 1% of how much work went into this over the course of so many years. So yeah, we were all just true partners. It was a really beautiful and significant collaboration.
There's a moment in the story where you took me from sort of being on the verge of laughing to actually crying. And it's when you're talking about something of a success story, and that is an African American female Baltimore school police officer who's launched a mentoring program for Black girls. And she approaches a student, and the student's initial and instinctive reaction is, Lord, what now? But the officer just wants to say, you're outstanding. And I wept.
Yeah, so that was obviously I was born in Baltimore. I was familiar with the GEMS program from my days there, but it was really actually the superintendent of the Baltimore school system that steered me in that direction, and I really laid that out because it really showed, I think, how like one interaction can change the course of a young person's life. And, when they told me that, they were laughing and they thought it was funny. And I like knew right then that that was something that needed to be in the story because so many encounters with police, especially for young Black students in school, do not turn out that way. And granted, I had done this reporting actually way early this year before, the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the debate around the role of police in schools. And I had a fleeting moment where I was like, oh man, does this change how I should approach this? And I just thought, absolutely not. Betty Covington is a police officer. She is a Black female police officer for decades, passed over for promotions 3 times, even though she met all of the qualifications, and is changing young girls' lives. And I thought, if we are writing a story about seeing Black girls, hearing Black girls, who are we to deny this Black woman her due because of what her colleagues do across the country? And, that was something that I got pushback on that from members of the community, including her, but we would be doing exactly to her what we were telling other people we shouldn't do to any other Black woman in this country.
Erica, in a recent podcast, my guest was Melinda Anderson, who's written a book on becoming a teacher. And she made the point that if education journalists are only talking to Black teachers about stories involving race issues, then we're doing it wrong. And I thought that was a fair point. And I'm wondering if there might be a similar argument to be made about how and when we feature Black girls in education stories.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, unless it's a story about race, and especially discipline comes to mind, you usually don't know the race of a student unless they bring it up themselves or it's, again about race. And what I will say is if you are only going to specific people in general for race stories, then you're doing it wrong. I've seen stories about racial justice that feature Black girls, but if you're going to students, you should make an effort to make sure that you are representative, right? And I think that's across the board for me, though. I mean, that's just how I roll in general. Like, I make it a point if I'm going to experts. This has really bothered me for a long time, where we quote the same experts from the same institutions, and that usually shuts out a lot of really smart, hardworking Black scholars who never get quoted in stories. So I just think, in general, education reporters and beyond, any kind of reporter should have a diverse pool of sources in their stories.
So we're talking about implicit bias in our reporting and ways to address it. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have to be mindful about how we bring our own lens to our work and that there are ways to widen that lens. And I think, paying attention to these kinds of stories, to what we're learning about how Black girls are being treated and portrayed, I mean, helping to raise that awareness, I think that's something every education reporter should be doing right now.
Yeah, and I really don't like to tell people how to do their jobs because I think we all do, for the most part. Education writers do a fantastic job of that. I read Rebecca Klein's story in the Huffington Post about the young girl who was kicked out of Zoom, and the care she took to right off the bat help us understand that this was a 9-year-old who did not understand what happened to her was really powerful. Grace at the Sentinel, who first showed the world what happened to Kaya, who we included in our story, the way that she wrote that story, the fact that she fought for and published the body cam video and followed it to the end, from a young Black girl being arrested at 6 years old to standing in the state house in a beautiful dress. I just think education reporters, we do a great job at this. And not all, but my favorite ones. And it's because we deal with children. I think there's something that we learn and is implicit actually in us to take care when we write about kids. So we have that going for us.
I couldn't agree more. I think you brought up some great examples. And I think there's also a commonality in your reporting this particular story and for example, in Rebecca Klein's, which is making it clear that this isn't a one-off. This isn't just some moment that happened frozen in time, that these experiences stay with these young people
Yes.
and it can shape their trajectory. I mean, you talk very poignantly. This little girl's got post-traumatic stress disorder from her experience that could shape her well into her future. And in the case of Rebecca Klein's story, the little girl, the 9-year-old, is now afraid to go back to class because she's embarrassed. That stays with them. And I think that's the care you're talking about here.
That's exactly right. And that's what I really set out to do in this story too, right? Like, I was not out to prove that if girls are disciplined in school, they could end up in the juvenile justice system. Physical confinement, it became very clear to me after speaking to so many of them, the idea of jail was not the worst thing that could happen to them. Not being able to wear a cute top, feeling like people don't like you, understanding like the magnitude of the weight that they carry, the expectation that you are under a different lens and under a different layer of scrutiny than your peers, feeling less than was really what was at issue here. And we often, associate school discipline with criminality, and rightfully so. But no one knows what happens when after the viral video. No one understands what it's like when mothers, it really does not matter what you tell your daughter about her worth because she is changed forever and you will never get her back. And when she is a mother, you worry about how that trauma could be generational. I mean, it was so deep. It really changed the course of the story. I really didn't want it to be about, well, the worst thing is that they could go to jail, because mental confinement, emotional wreckage is a whole other layer of baggage that young girls carry into adulthood. And you couldn't help but think, when you read about Kaya, you couldn't help but think about Sandra Bland, right? You couldn't help but think about Breonna Taylor. There were so many layers. It was really deep.
I know you said you don't like to tell people what to do. I'm going to very gently ask you to tell us what to do. Give us a few story ideas for some local reporters that you might want to see them look at in terms of discipline data in their local districts, or perhaps writing about the educational experiences of Black girls more generally.
Yeah, I would just say crunch your data, your local data. And what was really striking to me is, data by infraction really is sparse, even at the district level. One of the issues here, and why this issue has been for Black girls has been so overshadowed, is because we usually get data by, male, female, white, Black, Hispanic, and then it's broken down by special education students. You rarely get data that's Black female, white male, Black male, broken down by infraction. That's something that you might want to FOIA. I got really lucky because I found Latasha in Iowa, who was on the school board, who could demand that of staff. And it was really striking. I had never seen data like that before, outside of some studies where researchers had requested infraction data from certain districts to really drill down, or the Office for Civil Rights at the federal level had gone in and done an investigation and was able to get that more granular data to compare discipline and how certain administrators, under investigation had handled certain situations. But I think we would be really well served by really going to the district and asking for the most granular level data that they have on discipline and looking at infractions. Because I think the Iowa data, with the rates between Black and white girls being suspended for defiance and disturbances and non-aggressive, non-violent offenses, was stunning. I mean, it really was. And even when I went to the district and was like, hey, I got this data, I'm going to feature it, and I'm just wondering if there's anything, you want to say. They were just like, thank you for paying attention to this issue. We're really working hard. So if it doesn't exist, they can, I think, create it. And frankly, I never asked for that in Baltimore. And luckily there was a report that was released on Baltimore about 2 years ago that looked at some of the reasons that Black girls were punished. But I think that's the next level of the discipline debate. I really do. I think the overarching statistics are valuable and illuminating, but I think it needs to be seen as a pathway, not a destination anymore.
Erica Green is a correspondent for the New York Times covering the U.S. Department of Education, focusing on higher education policy, educational equity, and civil rights enforcement in the nation's K-12 schools. She's also an EWA board member. Erica, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me again.
That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.